All right, so we're going to continue with our lifespan development series. And in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about cognitive development and socio-emotional development in infancy. The lecture is a little bit longer than some of the other ones that I have, but it's because I'm covering two domains of development within a time period. So let me start the slideshow, and we're going to do a full screen slideshow from the current slide. All right, so let's start with cognitive development. Now, you may recall from a previous lesson that cognition refers to how we think or make meaning of the world. So according to Piaget, he proposed that we build mental structures that help us adapt to the world around us. And adaptation involves adjusting to the new environmental needs. Now, we'll talk about assimilation and accommodation and things of that nature, which are processes of adaptation as we progress, but let's frame it here. Now, another thing that Piaget stresses is that children actively construct their own cognitive worlds through interaction with their environment. So he operates using a constructivist point of view. And then he also believed in stage theory. So there are systematic changes in thinking that occur at different points in their development. So let's talk about schemes, or some books will refer to that as schemata or schema. A scheme is a mental representation. It's a worldview, how you understand or organize your knowledge. Now, we have both behavioral and mental schemes. So a behavioral scheme might be related to physical activities. So your understanding of stacking blocks could be an example of a physical scheme. They could be simple actions that you perform on objects. A mental scheme, which is a cognitive activity, also develops in childhood. And here is where you develop strategies for problem solving. So within schemas, how does our schema develop? How does our worldview adjust itself or organize? Well, there are two processes at play. And the first one is assimilation. So if new information comes in, you try and organize it around the existing information. So if that new information matches the existing information, we refer to that as assimilation. It's naturally blended in. Now, you may have heard the term assimilation in the context of culture. And when we talk about culture, when people migrate from one part of the world to another, one of the options is to assimilate or blend into the host nation's dress, values, etc. I'm not saying that's necessarily the ideal, but that is an option. So you probably have heard of assimilation that way. Accommodation, again, we're dealing with schema, our worldview. Our worldview can shift when new information changes or is inconsistent with the existing information. So if that new information does not match the existing information, we have to go through a reorganization process to build that schema out. So assimilation, naturally blending in a schema. Accommodation is adjusting an existing schema, taking new information into consideration. And then organization is the process of grouping isolated behavior and thoughts together into a higher order system. Now, as we move through development, we're sometimes gonna be in a state of cognitive conflict, and sometimes we're not. So we go through this process of equilibration, or which is a way of saying going from equilibrium where everything's at balance and we're not in conflict to disequilibrium when there's more conflict. And we go in and out of states of equilibrium. And that's okay. It's expected that kids are going to be in periods of disequilibrium. And that occurs when this new information is inconsistent with the existing information, forcing us to potentially change the way we think about something. All right. So according to Piaget, we go through 4 stages of development, forgive me. And the 4 stages are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational thought. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, we are only going to talk about sensory motor development, and that occurs between birth to 2 years old, according to Piaget. So, why is it called sensory motor stage? Because a child understands their world through sensory input and motor output. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that it's not uncommon for infants physically to put things in their mouth. So it could be a biological process such as food, or it could be a way of mouthing an object to know what it is. So in the sensory motor stage, putting blocks in one's mouth serves another purpose, which is to understand what blocks are. It's interesting, if you look at an infant, an infant can play with a piece of fuzz for hours. And you might wonder, well, why can an infant play with a piece of fuzz for hours? They're exploring their world, trying to make sense of the world using their various senses. All right. Now, within the sensory motor stage, there are 6 substages that go from simple reflexes to primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, coordination of secondary circular reactions, tertiary reactions, and internalization of schemes. Now, when we talk about this, I'm going to go through them because I think it's important. A reflex is an unlearned response. It does not need to be taught. You naturally do it. There are many types of reflexes. The rooting reflex. The rooting reflex in infancy is if you stroke a baby's cheek, they're going to turn their head towards you in an attempt to latch onto a nipple and feed. The sucking reflex, the grasping reflex. The grasping reflex builds attachment. We also have things like the Babinski reflex, where if you stroke the soles of the feet, the toes curl in and expand. And there are many more: blinking reflex, breathing reflex. And we say that reflexes are unlearned responses because you don't need to be taught them. They naturally occur. They're involuntary responses to the environment. Now, what's interesting, though, is in infancy, reflexes can become more voluntary and we could gain more control over it. For example, I said to you the breathing reflex is reflexive, right? You don't need to be taught to breathe. You just naturally do it. But you can teach a regulation of the breath where you can intentionally control something that was involuntary. All right. Primary circular reactions. This is control over one's body. So the ability to coordinate movement of one's hand, interacting with various parts of the body, such as a baby moving one's hand to suck their thumb, would be a primary circular reaction. Now, circular reactions are repetitive behaviors. That's what they are. Primary is primary to the body. So it's the moving the body itself. Secondary circular reactions, which start to occur at about 4 to 8 months, right? Secondary circular reactions, now we're using our body to manipulate something outside of itself, to manipulate something in the environment, whether it be to take a sippy cup and drop it on the floor. Now, anyone who has kids has probably seen this on replay over and over and over. You have an infant that's about 6, 7 months sitting in a high chair. You give them a sippy cup. What do? They drop it on the floor. So what do? You pick it up, you put it back on the high chair. What do? They drop it on the floor. What do? You pick it up. What do? They drop it on the floor. And this goes on and on and on until the parent gets frustrated and says, listen, you little shit. No, just kidding. Don't say that to your kids. But what is the kid doing? Piaget is arguing that the kid is exploring. They're like little scientists exploring their environment. And I'm going to argue what the child is doing is learning the rules of gravity. They learn that when you drop a sippy cup, it falls to the ground consistently. And they need to drop that sippy cup over and over and over to reproduce their miniature science experiment, right? So they have to do it over and over to understand how gravity works. And on a social level, they're learning the rules of attachment, and they're learning the rules of parenting. The more you pick that sippy cup up, the more that child learns they can depend on you. You are reliable. So that circular reaction, that repetitive act of dropping the sippy cup, is a science experiment for an infant. So as much as I joked, do not get frustrated with your kid. They're doing it to learn about the world around them. Now, there is a coordination phase. The coordination phase happens at about 8 to 12 months. Now they're starting to coordinate the various senses, such as vision and touch. They're developing better hand-eye coordination, and they're refining their ability to manipulate things in their world. Now, tertiary reactions are using novel outcomes with 2 or more secondary reactions. So they're becoming more intrigued about the properties of objects and trying to create novel reactions. So something like a dropping response, they might learn that if they have a different release point, they can launch the sippy cup. So instead of just dropping it down, now they're throwing it, right? That's actually a tertiary reaction, learning a new outcome. And then by stage 6, which is 18 to 24 months, there's an internalization of the schemes and there's greater mental representation. All right, so the biggest goal, according to Piaget, you go through a series of stages, 4 stages, right? And a stage theory assumes that there must be some conflict that needs to be resolved between each stage. So one of the tests that needs to be demonstrated for mental representation is something called object permanence. And according to Piaget, object permanence is the awareness that an object continues to exist even when you cannot see it. Now, in early stages, first 6 months or so, out of sight, out of mind. So if an infant is playing with something and you don't want them to, just hide it. And then they'll just go on to the next thing. By about a year or so, now they're searching the common locations, but they don't really fully understand all the places it could be or fully understand object permanence. But by about 18 months, now they've mastered it. Now they've mastered object permanence. And they recognize that things don't just magically disappear. And that's why when you have a 2-year-old who wants cookies and you hide the cookie jar, they're going to take a chair from the kitchen and move it to the cabinets and climb up the chair onto the counters and search all of your cupboards till they find the cookie. Why is that? Because even at 18 months to 2 years old, that child knows that those cookies didn't just magically disappear. You just changed the location. Same thing with human beings. Now, I don't know if you've had the uncomfortable experience where you go out and then you come back. Let's say you went to the mall. You go to the mall and you come out of the mall and you go and you're like, well, where's my car? Do you say, whoa, my car just magically disappeared and it no longer exists? Poof, Harry Potter. No, you don't say that. You say, oh, geez, I don't know where I parked. Your first assumption is you can't remember where you parked. Let's say you did remember where you parked and your car is still not there. Do you now believe in Harry Potter and the magic? No, you don't. The next assumption, especially in New York, is maybe someone stole it. And that, forgive me for being a little cynical, right? And if they didn't steal it, maybe it got towed or whatever it is. But we understand that objects don't just magically disappear. They're somewhere. So if you ever lost your car or lost your keys, lost your remote, you're going to search high and low until you find it. Now, that's object permanence, awareness of the properties of an object. Object permanence is an understanding of mental representation, right? How objects exist in the world. Now, there are studies, and I'm going to talk about them, called violation of expectation studies, which demonstrate it's possible that children understand object permanence earlier than Piaget proposed. Because according to Piaget, it's about 18 months that you master object permanence, 2 years at its max. But in violation of expectation studies, it's demonstrated earlier. So here's just a model. I had a video, but it's not playing. I wanted to show you what object permanence looks like. You hide an object, they find it, hide an object, they find it, hide an object, move it to another location, and then it's not there. You want to see it, they're going to search for it. Well, depending on their age, they're either going to stop looking right away, they're going to search in one location, which is the common location, or they're going to search high and low. So here is an example of demonstrating mental representation much earlier. And we're talking about just a few months old. Kids demonstrate object permanence according to this study. So let's say you had a practice that didn't have a mouse in it, right? So you had a block, you had a ramp, and you had a truck, right? So you drop the trolley and it rolls down the ramp and goes to the end. So you're familiarizing with the process that the truck can go all the way to the end. Then what you do is you put the mouse behind the track and then you measure, or you drop the trolley and you want to see what the kid does. That is a possible event. So because the mouse is not actually on the track, the trolley can and should and does go to the end. But what happens when you put the mouse on the track? And then the trolley goes all the way through and goes to the end. That's impossible because according to laws of physics, objects in motion stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So this mouse on the track, this toy mouse, should stop the trolley from moving, but it didn't. And sure enough, even at a few months old, infants know that that shouldn't happen. So they look longer at that novelty preference experience. the impossible event shouldn't have happened, but they look. Now, let's evaluate Piaget on his claims about sensory motor stage. So Piaget claimed that certain processes are critical to help you move from one stage to another. What I'll tell you is that data does not always support this. For example, the A not B error. I said to you, according to Piaget, sometimes depending on your age, birth to 6 months, you're just out of sight, out of mind. By about 12 months, you should make the A not B error. What is the A not B error? You search location A, but you don't search location B. You search the common location, but no other location. So according to Piaget, that demonstrates you don't have mental representation. And then by about 18 months, 24 months the latest, you have full object permanence and whatnot. Now, what we have found in research is that kids don't always make the A not B error. Kids that were in the age that would fail some of Piaget's tests pass other people's tests. So the question is why? Why is it? And the answer is that maybe your perceptual abilities are much more developed than Piaget suggested. And it could be due to the fact that in the A not B task, you had to do a perceptual experience and a motor skill. So that requires two abilities, whereas a visual task is purely perceptual. You can demonstrate that earlier. Now, we also want to talk about, so shifting away from Piaget, I want to talk to you about other thoughts about cognition, such as conditioning. So, Rovi Collier did a study using a rotating mobile and tying it to the ankle of an infant, that they could get the mobile to rotate by shaking their leg. And what she found was that children can learn through classical and operant conditioning. And in the case of shaking one's leg, that's operant conditioning. The behavior was governed by its consequences. So when they shook their leg, the mobile spun, which made them more likely to shake their leg. So according to this, kids learn through conditioning. Now, we also need to pay attention to attention. Attention is that which you focus your mental energy on and how you sift through various information. In early infancy, so newborns, they fix their attention on the contours. And we talked about this in vision as well, actually, when we're talking about visual acuity. It starts by looking at the edges and then gets more refined through time. By 4 months old, infants scan more thoroughly and they show greater selective attention. That is to focus on one thing to the exclusion of another. We also talked about conditioning and habituation and disinhibition. So habituation was decreased responsiveness to a stimulus after repeated exposure. And disinhibition was a reversal of that, increased responsiveness after a change in stimulation. And we have a whole bunch of that. Now, how do kids learn? Well, they learn with support of caregivers as well. And that requires joint attention, which is the infant plus another person to focus on the same object or event. And that requires an infant to be able to track another person's behavior or what their attention is. And what we tend to see is that joint attention emerges at roughly about 7 to 8 months, but isn't fully observed until about 1 year old. And that might explain some of the language development stuff. Now, memory. Memory is the ability to retain information through time. And it has different processes and types. So encoding is the process of getting a memory in. There are other concepts called storage and retrieval. Storage is the process of holding on to a memory, and retrieval is the process of accessing a memory at a later date. So encoding, storage, and retrieval are oftentimes put together as a process of learning memory, almost like a computer model. Now, we also have to talk about the difference between implicit and explicit memory. Believe it or not, you have many different subtypes of memory. So an implicit memory is the kind of memory that you learn without conscious recollection. For example, learning how to walk. Because it is a motor skill that occurs due to rote habit or automatic, you don't recall learning when, and that's one of the many reasons why, but there are many implicit memories that just happen automatically. Whereas explicit memory requires conscious effort. So things like semantic memory, which is to remember random facts, or episodic memory, to remember different events in your life. These are more explicit memories which require more conscious effort. And explicit memory requires maturation in the hippocampus and the cerebral cortex, and this starts at 6 months. Now, I will tell you, there is something called infantile amnesia, and that is children don't usually remember things that happened to them before the age of 3. And part of the reason why there's infantile amnesia is that the way the brain develops and wires, and you have, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, programmed cell death, apoptosis, and synaptic pruning, that interferes with accessing earlier memories. So that's one of the explanations of infantile amnesia. So we talked about it. Another factor related to infantile amnesia could be immaturity of the prefrontal cortex. Now, your personality, your judgment, decision-making is in your prefrontal cortex, and that's another explanation. Another way that we could test memory is through imitation studies. And when you do imitation studies, you can do immediate copies or deferred imitation. So imitation is when they copy something. Well, Meltzoff and Moore demonstrated that infants have deferred imitation abilities, which is some level of mental representation and imitation skills at about 9 months. Well, according to Piaget, that's only supposed to happen at 18 months. Now, you might ask yourself, who cares? Why are we getting so caught up in the ages and when they acquired something? Well, when we develop a theory, we want to make sure that that theory is accurate. However, I will give Piaget a get out of jail free card. One of the things that a stage theorist would say is focus on the process, the stages, not the ages. And Piaget might ask you, well, maybe I didn't get the time frame right based on the tools I was using, but are the concepts right? Do you sequentially go in this order? And if you can agree with that, then my theory still holds merit. And that's where we are today. We believe that it still has some merit. Now, concept formation and categorization is important. So what are categories? It's basically grouping objects, events, or characteristics based on commonalities. Whereas a concept is what the category represents. And we can see other aspects of mental representation, once again, earlier than Piaget said. Perceptual categorization happens as early as 3 months. Conceptual categorization happens by about 7 to 9 months. And you develop by the age of 2 general categories. Now I'm going to talk to you about multiple category inclusions and that challenge in pre-operational stage, but I'm going to leave that out of this lecture. Now, how do we assess differences or individual differences in cognitive abilities in infancy? Now, this question, truth be told, I asked one of my mentors when we were talking about intelligence testing. And I noticed that most intelligence tests, and I say most, start at the age of 2 and later. So they really are starting after infancy. So I asked one of my professors, Dr. Jeffrey Halprin, I said, so how do you test an infant? And he smiled, and he does a lot of ADHD research. So he does do child assessment. And he said, you don't. You play with an infant. You don't test them. But as cute as that answer is, there are times when you might need to assess an infant's cognitive ability. For example, if, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, a child was exposed to drugs, they might have cognitive impairments, some head trauma, they might have cognitive impairments. So you might want to have some assessment. So here it is. Here are 3 examples of assessment scales and intelligence tests. So the Gessel test has 4 categories of functioning: motor ability, language ability, adaptive functioning, and personal and social abilities. Each of these are age-related norms. So we expect a child to perform with greater proficiency as they get older, right? So your benchmark of being considered normal is lower when you're younger than when you're older. The Bailey scales has 3 components. So it has a mental scale or a cognitive scale, a motor scale, and a behavioral profile. The Bailey is used often when assessing IQ and trying to determine whether a kid is on the autism spectrum. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, you're not supposed to diagnose autism formally until 2 or 3 years old. And I'm going to tell you, informally, you can diagnose it earlier when the symptoms are pronounced. And the Bailey could be used alongside other screening instruments. The Fagan test of infant intelligence is more of a processing test. So these are 3 examples. Now, scores on infant tests are not highly correlated with IQ scores in childhood. Your IQ becomes more stable as you get older. But in infancy, it's possible that your IQ score doesn't match at a later point in time. One exception is the Fagan test because it measures things like habituation and dishabituation, which are linked to intelligence at later points in time. All right, now language development. Language development involves a form of communication, whether it be spoken, written, or signed. And we talk about language development, and the question is, how does language development occur? Well, does it occur through reinforcement? As Skinner suggests, that you say your first word and your parents cheer. Does it occur through modeling where they teach you word by word? Or does it occur due to some natural biological process that's at play? Well, that debate of nature versus nurture in language development, we're going to talk about. But I also want to talk to you about examples of when there were severe deprivation or isolation. And I'm not going to go through all of the examples on the slide, but I want to talk about Jeannie. The case of Jeannie is as follows. So Jeannie was a child who was locked in a basement by her parents until the age of 13. Her parents never spoke to her. they gave her food on a tray, they chained her to a chair, and gave her a bedpan to go to the bathroom. Well, when Jeannie was 13, she escaped the basement. And when she was found, she was purely nonverbal. She spoke with grunts rather than words. Her motor development was interfered with. She walked like Frankenstein from the movie. That fluidity of gross motor development was interfered with. And she did not know how to use utensils, so she ate with her hands. And she's 13 years old. Now, for the sake of our lecture, our question is, can Jeannie acquire language? And would she master language at a later point in time? Now, I said in the first lecture that certain aspects of development, we have sensitive periods. And a sensitive period is a window of time when development is supposed to occur. And if development doesn't occur, it's going to be stunted. It's not going to be fully mastered. And sure enough, with Jeannie, psychologists worked with Jeannie, special educators work with Jeannie 40 hours a week for 4 years. And she never mastered language beyond the age of a typical 2-year-old, which is 1-2 word utterances. So if it was just modeling and reinforcement, as Skinner said, then Jeannie should have fully mastered language even at the age of 13. Now, language is cool. It's cool that no two people speak the same, even though we have the same language. What do I mean by that? There's infinite generativity. You can create an infinite, endless number of meaningful sentences using the same finite words and rules. And I'm going to ask you, why was Shakespeare Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare took the language of his day and turned it into meaningful experiences for people, meaningful plays, right? That's what made Shakespeare Shakespeare. Everybody else had the same language, but Shakespeare harnessed it in a very different way than everyone else. That's an example of infinite generativity. However, I will say new words are formed every year. New words are added to the dictionary every year. And in fact, Shakespeare also added several hundred words to the dictionary by words he created. So in some ways, using a finite set of words and rules, he kind of stretched it a little bit and created words, but the principle is a good one. Now, there are 5 parts of speech. There's phonology. The root of phonology is a phoneme or a sound. And each language has a certain number of sounds that are relevant to it. And a phoneme is the smallest amount of a sound that makes a difference in a given language. In English, we have about 40 different sounds, but each language has their own sounds. For example, if we were to shift our focus from the English language to Spanish, in Spanish, there are sounds that are not part of the English language. For example, there is something called enye. So if you go to Spain and you're looking for the bathroom, it's going to be written B-A-N with a little tilde above it, O. Is that bano? No, it's baño. But enye is a sound that we don't have in the English language, but if we were born in Spain, we would use. Double R is a rolling R for many dialects of Spanish. So if you're driving your car, a car is carro with a rolling R. Now let's shift away from Spanish and move to French. And I'm just going to play around a little bit more with you, and then I'm going to move on in the lecture. But in French, a double L is a Y sound. So there's a city in France spelled Varsailles. And in fact, there was a treaty that happened after a war there. It was called the Treaty of Versailles? No, Versailles. And in French, the double L is, Versailles. Now, let's shift to Middle Eastern languages. And I know a couple. I know some Arabic and I know some Hebrew. But I'm going to stay with Hebrew for the time being. In Hebrew, there are sounds that are not in other parts of the world, and they're called guttural sounds. So throaty sounds. So cha and are sounds that are part of Hebrew. So there is a holiday, usually that's close to Christmas time, that Jews celebrate, where they light candles. What's the name of that holiday? Many of you are saying, oh, I know, isn't it Hanukkah? It's not actually Hanukkah, it's Chanukah. Cha, right? So the CH, cha, Chanukah. So that's a sound in Hebrew that isn't in English. The word for eyeball is ayin. Now, some people say ayin where they don't do the guttural sound, but ayin is for eye. And there's a word for deer written TZVI. And you're probably thinking that Hebrew word is tizvi. No, you taz the T called tzvi. So there are certain sounds that each language has. So you get the idea though. Let's move to morphology. Morphology is about shifting a word from singular to plural, from present tense to past tense. So changing the meaning of a word by a suffix, or a part of the word, I should say. Then we have, I'm going out of order, pragmatics. Nope, I lied. Then we have semantics. Semantics is the meaning of a whole word. And you might have had with your friends, oh, we're arguing over semantics. What does that mean? You're arguing over the meaning of a word, right? So when we went from sounds to adding parts to a word, now we have whole words and understanding words. From words, we get sentences, and this is why I went out of order. Sentences, we're talking about syntax. Syntax is how you string words together to make sentences. And last but not least, pragmatics are the unwritten rules of language, things like sarcasm. So you could say something and mean something entirely different, such as, sure, you were in the bathroom, right? And the way you said that is sort of like you don't believe them. Or you could use words that mean the opposite. So you might call someone who's short, hey, big guy, but you're trying to be playful for the opposite. And that's pragmatics. All right, gestures are also part of it, nonverbal communication. So now let's talk about it. So language develops in infancy throughout the world across a similar path and sequence. regardless of the language, you have to deal with phonetics, morphology, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. So we typically start with sounds, though. And sounds turn into like jargon, expressive jargon, where you're babbling and cooing. Babbling, actually, cooing is pure vowel sounds. Babbling is a vowel with a consonant. And then eventually you say your first word. It happens in a sequence. Now, we talked about cooing and babbling already, but you could also use gestures. So pointing is a nonverbal gesture to communicate, I want that, right? Waving bye-bye. Before you can say goodbye, you can wave your hand and gesture, and that's a nonverbal communication strategy that you acquire at about 8 to 12 months. Typically, you say your first word at 12 months to about 18 months. And if your child is not speaking at 18 months, I strongly encourage you to do a whole host of testing. And in fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics suggests you should test a child for autism at 18 months and 2 years. So why 18 months? The answer is that you're supposed to have acquired language in that normal range of 12 or 13 to 18 months. All right. Now, understanding language comprehension, you understand 50 words by about 13 months. By 18 months, you can say or speak 50 words. So you'll notice that speech and language comprehension develops quicker than speech and language production. So, and on average, people typically say their first word between 10 to 15 months with the expectation of about 12 months. Now, we do have a vocabulary spurt, a word explosion, whatever you want to say, and that also happens at around 13, 14 months through early childhood, massive rapid acquisition of words. But you say your first words in this span of time. Now, you have your vocabulary spurt. One of the midpoints is about 18 months. So, but just because you learned a word doesn't mean you use the word properly. So you can engage in what's called an overextension in language or an underextension in language. An overextension in language is to apply a word that goes beyond the meaning of a word. So if you were to call every four-legged animal a dog, that would be an overextension, right? Because there are four-legged animals that are not dogs. There are cats, there are camels, there's so many. An underextension is when you use the word too narrowly. And if anyone has done babysitting, you might have come across this with an underextension where a child asks you for a blanket. So you just look around the house and grab the first blanket you can see. And the child says, no, that's not a blanket. And you're looking at the kid and you're looking at the blanket and you're like, pretty sure this is a blanket, kiddo. But the kid's insistent, no, that's not a blanket. What are they really saying? Only their favorite blanket is a blanket. So they're using the word too narrowly. That's an underextension. Now, telegraphic speech, which is where you use short sentences, 2 or more words, starts to happen at 18 to 24 months. And here are some of the language milestones that we go through. Now, what are some factors that impact language development? Well, evolution of the nervous system and vocal apparatus play a role, right? So different parts of the brain are going to be responsible for different speech and language functions. We also have vocal cords, the vocal apparatus. And some of this is part of the reason that no other species that we know so far has demonstrated full and comprehensive language. The prospect that's out there now are dolphins. We're not sure if dolphins actually communicate using proper language, but all other species, either they don't have the vocal apparatus to express language or the brain development to express language. And we've tried to train a whole host of species, from parrots who have vocal apparatus, and you have really smart parrots or birds like the African gray who can really communicate beyond other birds. But even that, it's relatively simple in language. It's not, you're not going to have a deep, sophisticated conversation with an African gray and say, so, hey, birdie, you know, what do you think the meaning of life is? The bird's going to be like, what do you think the meaning of life is? Right? It might parrot back what you said rather than answering the question because it's too beyond their comprehension. So we worked with various avian models, and we worked with primate models because primates are the closest we have to human beings and the bonobo chimp. And we see even the most intelligent chimps, bonobo chimps, do not fully master language. All right, so that's the nervous system and vocal apparatus. Now, there are two parts of the brain. I talked about speech and language production and speech and language comprehension. Two parts of the brain I want to draw attention to, even though the circuit of language development includes several other parts. But Broca's area is responsible for speech and language production. When I lecture to you, when I give this video, I'm using Broca's area. Those of you who are watching this video, studying this video, trying to understand this video, speech and language comprehension occurs with Wernicke's area. And here are just the different parts of the brain highlighted. Broca's area, interesting to note, is in the frontal lobe. And in an earlier video, I talked about Broca's area being in the frontal lobe. What's interesting is that Broca's area is very close to the motor cortex. And in order to speak, I can't just speak unless I move my mouth and properly place my tongue where it needs to go. So it isn't just about thinking of the words and saying them. There are other things that have to happen with my mouth and tongue. So the fact that Broca's area and the motor cortex are next to each other should not shock you. And then similarly, you also see Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe near the auditory cortex, because in order to understand, most often you have to start with hearing, right? Hearing leads to understanding. Now, and both of the areas are in close proximity to one another. And you might hear a phrase, things that wire together, fire together, which is a fancy way of saying that if the brain structures are next to each other, they probably communicate and serve a shared function. Now, I talked to you, nature versus nurture was the debate. Well, Noam Chomsky talked about this language acquisitional device, which is a biological endowment, mental structure that only humans have. And that is why humans can speak and have developed language and other animal models don't. Now, I talked about brain regions. It's important to note that Noam Chomsky never said, well, that's the region that's responsible for speech and language. Never said it. Okay, so it's a theoretical concept. Now, there are other people like B.F. Skinner who said language occurs through reinforcement and modeling. And then there's also an interactionist view that says some things are wired, but you still need to be exposed to environments to acquire language. And your vocabulary is linked to your parents and how your parents talk to you, and is linked to socioeconomic status. So here is a graph from your book. So let's talk about socioeconomic status and the parents' utterances to the child per hour. We see that in the professional sphere versus the working sphere, parents tend to communicate more with their kids, and we see that that creates a shift in cumulative vocabulary words. So lower socioeconomic statuses are predisposed for fewer number of words, which when we think longitudinally could interfere with their performance in school as well. Now, parents engage in interactions with their kids to help draw attention to language. And there's something called child-directed speech, or motherese, or baby talk, whatever you want to call it. Have you ever noticed that when we talk to kids, we talk with exaggerated sounds like hello, and we speak so, oh, you're so cute, right? We change our tone and we put more of an emphasis. Well, child-directed speech serves a function. And I know there are some parents who say, oh, I'm not going to engage in baby talk. You should, because it's going to capture your child's attention, and it's going to teach your child important breaks in sentences, so they're going to acquire language better. Other strategies that we do to enhance the acquisition of language is recasting, which is to rephrase what a child said, an expanding state, which is to repeat what the child said, but in a correct structure. So if there are grammatical errors, fixing that, and labeling, and that helps. Now I'm going to shift. All of that was cognitive development. Now I want to shift to socio-emotional development. So emotions or feelings or affect, right? Feelings happen on the inside. Affect is the outward expression of emotion that occurs when a person is in a state or interaction that's important to them. And there are different kinds of emotions. There are some basic emotions. There are more complex emotions. But emotions develop based on both biological and environmental factors, as with everything. Remember, I said the debate, nature versus nurture, is all but been resolved to be nature via nurture. One interacts with the other. So sure, there are changes in the emotional capabilities across age, and different brain regions play a role in the acquisition of emotions. And believe it or not, emotions are the first way we communicate with parents, such as crying. But social relationships, environment provide the setting by which you can acquire and express a variety of emotions. So I want to talk to you about primary emotions. Primary emotions, or what we call basic emotions, are fairly universal. And I say fairly universal because there's research by Paul Ekman, who did a whole bunch of emotion research cross-culturally, and he found things like happiness, sadness, anger, they are uniform across the globe. But self-conscious emotions, right, which require self-awareness, a sense of me-ness versus us-ness, those are more complex emotions, and they are not uniform across the globe. So there are cultural variations in complex emotions and the value we put on complex emotions. All right, so let's talk about emotions. As we said, emotional expressions are some of your first communications to your parent through crying. And emotional expression is how you build a bond with your first relationships. Positive interactions are described as reciprocal or synchronous emotions. Now, crying. Another thing I'm going to say that be careful with, parents get bothered when their kid cries, when an infant cries. And I'm going to tell you, I know that it's frustrating, and I have kids of my own. So when a kid cries, it can cut to your essence, cut right to your core. But I want you to remember that if you say your first word at roughly 12 months, that means for 12 months, the only way you could communicate to people in your world or around you is through crying. And there are basic cries, wah, 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 that comes from things like being hungry, or being tired, or being poopy. Then there's an angry cry, which is a deep groan. And then there's a pain cry, which is a shrill, high-pitched cry, which starts with like a wind-up where they're trying to catch their breath. So listening to the type of cry might communicate to you what their needs are. And it takes time as a new parent to pick up what they're trying to communicate, but you'll get there. We also have smiling. There's a reflexive smile, and early in infancy, kids smile at any change in stimulus, potentially, or they could cry at any change in stimulus. It's more reflexive. But as they get older, there's a social smile, which sort of is in response to something that happens in their environment. Another thing we have to talk about are things like stranger anxiety and separation anxiety. Stranger anxiety and separation anxiety are normal, healthy reactions in infancy. Stranger anxiety is a sense of fear or weariness to strangers, whereas separation anxiety is a fear when you're separated from a parent or loved one. So when you're dropped off at the babysitter, it's not uncommon for kids to cry when they're either exposed to a stranger or they're put in a situation where their caregiver leaves. Now, the intensity of the stranger anxiety depends on individual differences. Some people are more worried about strangers than others. It depends on the setting. The more familiar the setting, the more comfortable you are. So if a stranger comes into your house, you might have less stranger anxiety than if it's in an unfamiliar place. And who the stranger is and how they behave, how they interact with other people you care about. You might engage in social referencing. And because they're not nervous, it might tell you you don't need to be. Now, separation anxiety, which your book calls a separation protest, is also common. Now, you'll notice that it peaks across the globe in infancy. Typically, it peaks in infancy. Now, when it starts and when it ends, there are cultural variations, as you see in this graph. But for US children, it's about 15 months that it peaks and then it stops. Now, we won't diagnose a child with separation anxiety disorder till about 5 years old. So even if the child is feeling a sense of clinginess beyond infancy, that's okay. Don't get too caught up in that at that age. Now, how can you calm a child? Well, caregivers can soothe a child by holding them, singing to them, wrapping them up in a blanket, swaddling them. So caregivers can influence infants' neurobiological regulation of emotions, but after a while, infants learn to regulate their own emotions. They engage in self-soothing. They engage in self-distraction, so changing what they think about. And language, they can communicate their emotions to regulate it. So that's the role of the caregiver and the role of the child. Now, temperament. Temperament, this is the relatively hardwired or biologically inherited emotional reactivity that's characteristic to the child. Said a lot of words. Long story short, children are wired emotionally, and they're wired differently. And Thomas and Chess talk about various classifications of emotion and temperament. They say that about 40% of children are what's called the easy child. The easy child adjusts to change relatively quickly. They're cooperative. They tend to be positive in general with their emotions, optimistic. That's an easy child. About 10% of children are called the difficult child. That's a child that tends to have a more pessimistic worldview, resists change at all costs, is oppositional, that doesn't comply, that is a difficult child. A slow to warm up child, where about 15% of children fall into that category, they are also positive and optimistic like an easygoing child, but they need transitions. If they're going to adjust to new environment, it takes them a little bit more time to adjust. And then, of course, there are children who don't fit perfectly into any of these, which is called an unclassified child. All right. Now, Kagan has another model, which is looking at inhibition to the unfamiliar. Now, we also look at Rothbard and Bates classification. We look at extroversion or surgency. Extroversion is how sociable is a child. Some children tend to be more shy or reserved. Other children tend to be more outgoing. That's one factor related to temperament. Negative affect, optimistic versus pessimistic. And then effortful control is your ability to self-soothe and regulate your own emotions. All right. So we talked about Kagan says children inherit physiology that bias them to a particular temperament. But the good news is that even though you're hardwired for temperament, it can be modified through experience. All right, now biological influences on temperament include physiology, different brain structures, genetics or heredity. Our contemporary view is that temperament is biologically based, but evolves through time. What about gender differences or cultural differences in temperament? Well, we know that parents interact or respond differently to children based on their gender. So that's going to create differences in temperament. And we know that parents interact with children differently based on their cultural value system. And that's going to affect temperament. Why is it that more children in the United States are viewed as extroverted or outgoing, whereas more children in China are viewed as introverted? Well, there might be cultural value systems at play that drive some of this temperament. And a goodness of fit model matches a child's temperament with the environmental demands. So that's emotional development. Now we have to talk about personality development. Erickson was one of those theorists we touched upon in an earlier lecture. And Erickson says that you go through a series of stages, 8 stages of psychosocial development. And the first stage is called trust versus mistrust. And that happens in your first year of life. And the question is whether or not you view those people in your environment as consistent, responding to your needs, or unpredictable, and whether the world is a safe place or not. If you view the world as a safe place and you view your caregivers as reliable or predictable, you're going to develop a sense of trust in the world around you. If you have unpredictable or inconsistent parents, you're going to develop mistrust in the world around you. Now, it's not completely resolved in the first year of life, but that is the crisis that is developing. Now, we develop a sense of self, or we start to develop a sense of self at about 18 months. And what's interesting is the second stage is autonomy, right? Developing a sense of individuation or self-governedness. Now, that's between the ages of 1 year and 3 years of life, or 12 months to 36 months. And you're trying to develop a sense of being self-governed. How many of you have heard of the phrase the terrible twos? Well, they're not really terrible. What's happening is that the child is developing a sense of empowerment, that they could control themselves and their environment. So they're trying to develop a sense of independence or autonomy. Now, do they fully have it? No. Does it need to be refined? Yes. But this is part of the process of them developing autonomy. So if your kid is a little bit defiant at 2 years old, please don't be bothered, because they're trying to find their voice. Now, each stage builds on successive stages, right? So things happen and predispose the next stage for success or failure. So if you trusted the world, you're going to be more likely to trust yourself and be autonomous, self-governed. Whereas if you doubted the world or mistrusted the world, then you're going to be more likely to have shame and doubt within yourself. Now, when we talk about play, so face-to-face play starts to happen at about 2 to 3 months. We do peekaboo. We see that kids respond well to faces. They like faces over objects. And we've done research on that. Now, face-to-face play decreases after about 7 months, and then it's shifted to peer interactions that increase between 18 months to 24 months when they're starting to walk and run, and they could go to the playground. So that increased motor ability opens up a world of opportunities for them so that they can be more social. Now, social referencing, I already talked to you about that. So social referencing is trying to know how you're supposed to express emotions by looking at other people. That starts to emerge at the end of the first year and improves in the second year. Now, I said to you that when it comes to stranger anxiety, social referencing is helpful. So they look, well, no one else is afraid, maybe I don't need to be afraid. So that's that. Now, attachment is a close emotional bond with a caregiver or loved one. Now, there are different theories of attachment. So according to Freud, attachment forms to those who provide oral satisfaction. So your first attachment is to your mother because they breastfeed you, at least in his day. Now we bottle feed, but because the mother is the source of oral satisfaction, they're the first attachment. Now, one thing we found is Harry Harlow found that physical satisfaction or biological need or drive reduction isn't enough, because he found that body contact was responsible for attachment and feeling safe more than food. And he did that with his monkey study with the cloth monkey versus the coil monkey. And Erickson found that trust is developed through responsive parenting and sensitive care and physical comfort. And according to Bowlby, newborns are wired biologically to form attachment with caregivers. Now, this is the graph of infants that were fed with a monkey versus a cloth monkey. And we see that whether they were fed with a wired mother or whether they had a cloth mother with no feeding, both groups spent more time, significantly more time, with the cloth mother relative to the wired mother. Even the kids that were fed by the wired mother. So body contact provides a sense of safety and security that goes beyond just feeding. Now, there are 4 phases of attachment. Birth to 2 months, infants direct their attention to human figures. By phase 2, which is 2 to 7 months, attachment becomes focused on one figure, usually the primary caregiver. Phase 3, by 7 to 24 months, specific attachments occur. And I'm going to tell you that you can form multiple attachments today. And by 24 months, which is phase 4, children become far more aware of other people's goals and feelings and take this into consideration when they form their own actions. So those are the 4 phases of attachment. Now, there are different kinds of attachment. A securely attached child. Actually, let me pull back. Mary Ainsworth did a study called the Strange Room or Strange Situation study, in which she studied attachment, and it capitalized on stranger anxiety and separation anxiety. And what Mary Ainsworth did was she had a parent in a playroom with their kid, and then a stranger came in, stood afar, came closer, sat next to the parent, interacted with the parent. Then the parent left. The stranger interacted with the child now, then left, and then the parent came back. And they wanted to see, well, how did the children respond to the comings and goings of their caregiver? Well, a securely attached child is going to be mildly bothered by the separation of their caregiver, so the parent leaving, but they're going to be comforted and feel safe and secure when the parent comes back. An insecure avoidant child is an apathetic child. They don't care about you leaving. They don't care about you coming back. They don't come up to you for comfort. An insecure resistant child is not only do they not come up to you for comfort, but if you approach them, they push you away, they might kick you, they might bite you. And largely it's because they had a profound reaction to your leaving. So these are the 3 common ones, but you could also have a disorganized attachment, which shows erratic responses. Now, Ainsworth's study is good and it adds to the picture, but it has been criticized as being culturally biased. So in communities that a large group of people are responsible for caregiving. So you might have heard the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, there are places in the world where the village is partially responsible for raising the child. And in those societies, you see less of these insecure attachments. All right, so here's a cross-cultural depiction where the vast majority of children are securely attached. Now, in Western nations, if you're not securely attached, you tend to be avoidant, whereas in Japan, you tended to be more resistant. That's the model. Now, understanding differences in attachment is important. Look, attachment is the foundation of later psychological development, and it predicts social behavior in schools and in romantic relationships and in the workforce. So attachment is very important, but early secure attachment is not the only path to success because kids are resilient and adaptive. So even kids who experience adverse childhood events can still develop attachment. Genetics play a role in attachment that's not emphasized sufficiently, and cross-cultural differences are important. Now, the family is part of a subsystem, right? It is reciprocal. The child is linked to the parents are linked to the child is linked to their siblings, and each subsystem has a reaction to one another. And then in other parts of the world, you even have extended family that play a role. Now, it's important to understand that there is an adjustment phase for parents in first year of life. When a couple gets together and they have no kids, they are each other's world. But what's interesting is as soon as you have a child, the focus shifts from the marriage to the child. And that becomes a primary focus. And that can create some marital strife or relational strife because people start to feel like they're forgotten. Now, we also need to understand that there's a reciprocal socialization by where the parents socialize the child, but the child socialize the parents back based on their behavior, and parents serve as scaffolding and guiding. So here, again, that's another graph. Now, maternal and paternal caregiving, we see an increase of number of fathers who are stay-at-home parents. Mom is going to work, dad's staying home with the kids, or one dad's going to work and the other dad's staying home. And what we find through research is fathers can be just as competent as mothers in caregiving. But what's interesting is how mothers and fathers interact with children is very different. Mothers are more likely focused on childcare activities like feeding and changing diapers and bathing, whereas fathers tend to spend more time engaging in play and wrestling and things like that. Now, fathers get to be more involved when they work fewer hours, when they're younger, when their children are boys, and when there's greater intimacy in the relationship. Now, here is a circle showing you the bidirectional exchange that happens between the marital relationship, the child, and parenting. We also need to talk about childcare. More children are engaged in public childcare than before. However, parental leave policies are starting to be granted. And in Western nations, there are laws to protect family medical leave or for taking care of children. But what we find interesting is that the United States grants the shortest period of parental leave than any other country, Western nation. And oftentimes it's unpaid leave. So if the parents have to go back to work, who's taking care of the children? I said they're put in public child care centers, daycares, babysitters. And what we tend to see is that socioeconomic status plays a role in childcare as well, insofar as lower socioeconomic status children tend to have poorer experiences in childcare. All right, so when we talk about socioeconomic status, we can look at the group size, ratio, characteristics, and we tend to see lower socioeconomic status have poorer quality and fewer positive interactions in childcare, which is a problem. All right, so that is our lecture on the cognitive as well as the socio-emotional development that happens in infancy. So I'm gonna stop my share and I'm gonna stop the recording, and I wish you all the best. Take care, everyone.